Welcome everybody. My name's Peter Holland and I'll be chairing this panel discussion, Tales of the Unexpected. So as you can see, and as you all know, this discussion is part of the Royal Society Summer Exhibition, which is an annual series of events on science and technology in the UK. And the aim of these events is to provide an opportunity for discussion and interaction with scientists about their research. So what we're going to do in this discussion today is, first of all, we're going to start off with some short talks from the various panelists, and then we're going to sit down and hopefully there'll be discussion and questions from you all so that we can get involved in a lively discussion and debate about this topic. So before we start, however, can I first just remind everyone to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off? That includes the panelists as well. And I must also point out that the event today is being filmed. So it's being recorded so that it's not going out live, but it will be available to watch later on demand through the Royal Society website. So you need to be aware of that. Okay, so in this event today, what we're going to be examining is the diversity of animal life. For example, one of the key questions is going to be, what sorts of species are still being discovered today? And also, what species are we in danger of losing by extinction, and why? So let's look at the first one, discovery of animal species. And I think if you were to sort of take a dispassionate look at that, you might think, well, surely we're asking the wrong question. Surely everything's been discovered. And you might be forgiven for thinking that the real golden age of discovery of animal species was long ago, maybe in the 15th and 16th century, because that was the time when explorers were traveling the world and bringing back species and specimens from all these exotic corners of the world. And to some extent that is true, and a glimpse into that sort of excitement can be seen from, if you look at some of the works which were published at that time. These are a few pictures that I've just taken from an amazing work by Konrad Gessner called Historiae Animalium, which was published in the 1550s. And that's a phenomenal book, many volumes, describing the diversity of animal life as known then. And if you just take a look at some of these pictures that I've taken from that work, you can see they're from all over the world. We've got species here from the Americas, from the Far East. There are deep marine species. It's quite impressive to look at the diversity that was known then. I can't say they got everything right. There's a variety of species here which I certainly don't recognize. Maybe they've gone extinct. Or maybe there was just an element of confusion at the time. But really, we're looking at the wrong time. The real age of discovery is now. Discovery really does continue apace. New species of animals are being described every day from around the world. It's difficult to put a number on how many. Maybe a few a day, maybe 20 a day, maybe 30 a day, depending on whose estimates you use. So a lot of discovery is happening now. There are even new species turning up in the UK, mainly small insects and nematode worms, which have never been seen before, are being found in the UK. Sometimes it's new technologies and techniques which are leading to discovery of new species, and I hope that's something we'll turn and have a closer look at. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So in the 1990s, researchers in Bristol found that the common pipistrelle bat, which we all see flying around, is in fact two completely different species. And they can be distinguished on the basis of their sonar frequencies, their precise habitats where they live, and also a close look at their genetics revealed that they really are two completely different species. Similarly, in about 2009, two research groups simultaneously, a group in France at Concarneau and a group in Plymouth in this country, discovered that the common skate, which is shown here, this particularly large fish there, is again two different species. And the map at the bottom shows the distribution in the British waters of those two species, which we formerly thought was one species, the common skate. Now that's actually a really important discovery because despite its name, the common skate is not at all common. In fact, it's now pretty rare. And even before this discovery, it was listed as a critically endangered species. Now, of course, it's twice as endangered because it's now that so-called small population of one species is actually two even smaller populations of two species. So it's really important that we get these things right. So that brings me to the subject of endangered species. So as a planet, we are losing species, and we're losing species fast. There's complex reasons behind that, which I'm sure we'll get on to discuss. They might include a combination of land use changes, climate change, direct exploitation of species, and also spread of virulent diseases. Some have even argued that we're in the midst of what we might call the 6th mass extinction on the planet. So we need to look at that and discover whether that's really happening and what the implications are. So our panel today is going to discuss those issues in more detail, the discovery of species and the loss of species. So I'm going to introduce our panel, who are Professor Jeff Boxall, who is Deputy Chief Scientific Officer at the Natural History Museum in London. And he's a taxonomist and an evolutionary biologist specializing in crustaceans. Professor Charles Godfrey is Hope Professor in the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford, and President of the British Ecological Society. He works on ecology and evolutionary biology. And Dr. Sam Turvey is a Royal Society University Research Fellow and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Zoology, which is part of the Zoological Society of London. And his research explores pre-human ecosystems and the dynamics of extinctions. So what's going to happen now is each panel member is going to speak for just a few minutes on their area of expertise, and then we're going to sit down and hopefully engage in a more detailed discussion. So I think Jeff is first.
Thank you, Peter. Well, welcome, everybody. I work on crustaceans, and I thought my remit for tonight would be to talk about the marine environment. You know, the oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface to an average depth of 3.7 kilometers. That's an awful lot of water. It's the largest habitable volume on the planet. And do you know what it's full of? It's full of copepods. Now, you've probably never heard that word before, copepods. You can think of them as the insects of the sea. So they are related to insects, but they're tiny crustaceans, relatives of the crabs and lobsters and shrimps and so on. And actually, they're really quite stunningly beautiful animals. And they're everywhere where there is water, from the surface of the ocean to the depths of the deepest trenches. So these are one of the most abundant life forms on the planet. And as I say, probably most of you haven't heard the word even before you came in tonight. So I hope you'll go away enthused about copepods. They don't all look as beautiful as this. In the North Sea, this guy is one of the really most common copepods. It's about 8 millimeters long, sort of transparent, but you see running down the center it has an oil sac. This is an incredibly nutritious animal, and these are a very important link in the food chain. So these feed on the single-celled algae that are the producers in the oceans, and they in turn are fed upon by the fish. But they're that middle link in the food chain, so they're incredibly important to the ecology of the oceans. And that oil sac is the reason why herring and mackerel and so on have an oily flesh. Herring feed on copepods all their lives, right from fry up to adults. And many other fish feed on copepods when they're small, although they might change their diet as they get older. So these are incredibly important and incredibly abundant. So in a cubic meter of the North Sea in the spring bloom, you could have more than 10,000 individuals of these, this one species. So copepods are important. They are fed on by fish, but in one of those delightful little symmetries of nature, they also eat fish. So some copepods are parasites. These belong to the same group of animals. It's incredible how different they are. That's the joy of evolutionary biology. How on earth do you get from this to this? So these are all fish parasites. Some of them occur in British waters, some of them are more exotic. Some of them were new species. The top left-hand one is a new genus I described a couple of years ago. Some of these others haven't actually been described yet. So there's a lot of new animals out there. But these are influential in aquaculture. So the top left-hand animal is a sea louse. The salmon louse is the single biggest health hazard for farmed salmon. And farmed salmon is big business. So in Northern Europe and North America, the salmon louse causes 180 million euros losses per annum to the salmon aquaculture. So these have a serious impact on aquaculture. And the variety of body forms is amazing. But they don't only parasitize fish. You also find them on other invertebrates. So I love this kind of bee movie poster from the Metro. But that blobby thing in the middle is a colonial tunicate. It's an invertebrate. And it's an invasive species. Nothing can stop the blob. This is a rather nice article. It says, not all resemble cat's vomit, which I thought was an interesting observation. In other words, some tunicates are quite beautiful. Well, these also are parasitized by copepods. So that's another copepod. You could recognize it. It's got antennae and a rostrum and 4 pairs of swimming legs. But it looks very different from Calanus, the animal that dominates the plankton. But these are an important natural enemy of these invasive tunicates, colonial tunicates. So copepods may have some kind of relevance in dealing with invasive species. But they occur on all kinds of invertebrates. So this is a polychaete worm that lives in sediments. And the white things at the top are pairs of egg sacs from parasitic copepods that live in the polychaete. Now, I've just been working on polychaetes, and to echo something that Peter just said in his introduction, I've just described 4 new genera and 12 new species from polychaetes in British waters. Now, these are things that people haven't looked closely at. They're quite big, quite obvious, but people haven't looked in great detail before. So we're finding a lot of new taxa from UK waters. And I'm going to make one final switch now. Copepods also live in the sediment. They tend to be small, and they live in interstitial spaces between sediment grains, in marine sediments, but also in groundwater. And this is a cave on a little island called Muna, south of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And this cave is used by the locals for washing clothes and for washing themselves, and there's a nice aroma of detergent. We sampled there and found lots of new species. They don't seem to mind that there's detergent in the water. And these caves around the margins of tropical and subtropical islands turn out to be home for a particularly impressive range of unusual crustaceans. So I've been interested in this as a sideline as well as working on parasites for a while because the animals, the copepods in these caves, are very close to what we think the ancestral copepod looked like. So it's something that tells us a disproportionate amount about the evolutionary history of the group. But these kinds of caves, where you have a bit of fresh water, but underneath you have salt water that's penetrating from the nearby coast, when you get down into the salt water, you find fantastic things. And you find these remipedes. Now this is a class of crustaceans. Class is a high level of group. Okay, mammals are a class. This is a class of crustaceans. They look like centipedes. They were only discovered in 1981, and they were discovered when scuba divers developed the kind of kit, reliable kit they needed to penetrate deep into caves. So these are not small. I mean, many of the animals I've been talking about are small. These are 3 or 4 centimeters long, and they look like centipedes, but they're actually related to shrimps. So there are some real novelties out there. So as Peter said, the age of discovery, we're in it. Thank you.
So Jeff has just been trying to persuade you to love the insects of the sea. And I think my argument is, why go for a substitute? Learn to love the insects of the insects. And so what I'm going to try and persuade you in the next 4 or 5 minutes is that, well, all insects are wonderful, but one particular type of insect is wonderful. And then I want to tell you an anecdote, a story, which illustrates one of the themes tonight of the age of discovery. So you'll recognize here a butterfly, pretty butterfly unless you're a cabbage farmer. This is the large white butterfly. And it's laid some eggs on the right there. And those are little caterpillars that are hatching. But I'm not going to try and persuade you to love butterflies. You probably all do already. I want to try and persuade you to love a little group called parasitoid wasps. And you see this very cute little insect on the right there that's crawling over. And in fact, it has nefarious intentions. It is creeping up, and it is pumping eggs into each of those little caterpillars. And into those little caterpillars, those eggs will develop. Now, of course, you say, well, how can something that size develop in a little caterpillar? Well, what they do is the eggs hang around, and they wait until a caterpillar has fed up on your cabbages and become big. And it's only when the caterpillar is full grown, that's a full-grown caterpillar down there, that very cleverly it doesn't eat any of the nervous tissue or the sort of essential organs. So this caterpillar is walking around and it's looking normal and healthy, but just as it was coming up to pupate, suddenly these things burst through the integument, burst through the skin. And typically from a cabbage white butterfly, you'll get 20 or 30 of these beautiful parasitoid wasps, which then form a cocoon underneath. Now, if any of you are having difficulty in sort of thinking yourself into the wonders of this biology and things, I do advise you to go and see the Alien films and things like that, and you'll remember the famous chestbuster scene, which I won't keep on the slide longer than I need to. Now, that little wasp that I told you doesn't have an English name. It's called a Pantales. Is one of a representative of this vast group of parasitic wasps, all of whose larvae develop inside their hosts. And on this slide here, I've just put up 4. There are 100,000 described species of parasitic wasps. Of insects, they are probably the least known, and there may be 500,000 out there. So top left is a wasp quite common in the south of England. It's called Rissa. It's got this huge long, that's about an inch long, and its ovipositor, the thing that it uses to inject eggs, is an inch long itself. And it's boring it through the wood to get a larva of an insect deep inside the wood. The tip of the abdomen is actually hardened by metal to get through. Going down below it, that extraordinary thing with the sort of weird antenna, again, no English names. It's called a eucarytid. It's a parasite of tropical ants. It's one of the most extraordinary types. And the ones I love tend to be the very smallest. Bottom right there, that's the eggs of some moths. And these are parasitoids whose eggs themselves are laid in the eggs of the moths. And their whole development takes place within the egg of a single moth. And those are the adults that are hatching from the eggs. And they're about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters long. Parasitoid wasps include the smallest of all known insects. And then my lab in Oxford, we work on these things, including the things at the top. That's a tiny little wasp that is laying an egg inside an aphid. It sort of creeps up an aphid and then deftly swings its abdomens between its legs, jerks an egg into the aphids. And we use them as a system to study a variety of questions that we find interesting in biology. The coevolutionary interactions between a host and the parasite. Things that are interesting for all animals, including humans. Very hard to do experiments on humans. These parasitic wasps are a great model. And we also use them, aphids and also another group that attack very tiny insects that feed inside leaves. We use them as a model to look at community structure. Again, you can do things. But I want to finish with a story that's not from science, but is more from the natural history of these things. So we work on them scientifically, but I'm a naturalist. I'm not a proper taxonomist like Jeff. But I'm interested in the natural history of these organisms. And about 15 years ago, I happened to be in Ireland, in a wonderful place, the Cliffs of Moher. I don't know if anyone knows it here. So it's right on the west coast. And think peregrines and choughs sort of flying along the cliffs. And if you look in the top of the cliffs, there's a really interesting flora there, which includes one of the louseworks, Pedicularis. And so when I was there 15 years ago, I knew that there were some obscure flies that are associated with Pedicularis, and I collected them, and so collected the seed heads and reared them out, and then went home to try and identify them. And you'd expect that even quite small flies, we're in the UK, we've been studying these things for a long time, but it turned out that one I couldn't match at all. But to identify these things, and here I sort of get into some of the gruesome details of being an entomologist, the way you tell these flies apart is by dissecting the male genitalia. And all I got were 3 females, so I couldn't be absolutely certain. So I needed to go back to the cliffs of Moher to collect it. And I persuaded my wife that we should go there for our 10th wedding anniversary. And she was highly suspicious about that. Her background, I should say, is fine art and Italian, but I said there was a wonderful collection of Renaissance art just down the road. And by the time we got there, it was, again, I bet many of you have had holidays in Ireland like that, it poured with rain. And it just rained continuously, including when we were collecting this fly. So I said, look, if it is new, I will name it after you. So we got the male, dissected the genitalia, different from anything else, sent it to the European expert in this group of flies in northern Germany. He said it's new. Wrote it up, in fact, someone found it simultaneously in Scotland. We wrote it up together, described it, named it after my wife. Just about to submit it, the person from Germany, the European authority, came in and said, stop, stop. I've discovered it's been described before from Andorra 3 years ago. So this was really real problems at home with this. But to the rescue came the parasitic wasps. Not only was the fly new, but this wonderful little parasitic wasp there was undescribed. So let me introduce to you Dapnusa carolini, the parasitoid wasp that saved my marriage. Thanks very much.
So I work on mammals in contrast to the previous speakers, and mammals are far less diverse than groups such as parasitic wasps. There's only around 5,500 or so known species, but they've been disproportionately studied over the last few hundred years. Linnaeus, the famous taxonomist, in his the famous 10th edition of his Systema Naturae, included almost 200 out of 4,500 or so species. Cuvier on the right, by the early 19th century, this famous anatomist and paleontologist suggested that there were no new large mammals left to discover anywhere in the world. He was proved wrong, but this certainly shows that already by the early 19th century there was this kind of almost smugness that at least for large species on the planet we roughly knew where we were. This wasn't true, of course. In the last 20 years or so alone, about 400 new mammal species have been described, such as the unusual almost toothless rodent shown at the bottom left, discovered last year in Sulawesi, which sucks up earthworms through its toothless mouth like spaghetti. There's also been various large mammal species discovered throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. On the top left, we have the Yangtze river dolphin, the first specimen known to Western science, which was shot by a teenager on a duck hunt. On the right, we have a mammal, a beautiful species called the saola from Vietnam and Laos, which was discovered 20 years ago this year. However, the reason that there haven't been that many large mammal, in particular species discoveries in recent years, is because the few species that have been found were not discovered until very late because they are very rare and very threatened. And in fact, a lot of my work in mammals isn't particularly species descriptions. In fact, it's understanding the process of threat and extinction. Today, it's estimated that maybe about 25% or so of the 5,500 known mammals are threatened with extinction, from tigers to river dolphins to orangutans to obscure Caribbean rodents. There's both geographical and taxonomic biases in the patterns of threat we observe. On the bottom, you can see a map showing the distribution of mammal threat today, and it's disproportionately well overrepresented in Eastern and Southeast Asia in particular. And certain groups of mammals are more threatened than others. Although on average, as I said, about 25% of all mammals are threatened, almost 50% of the world's primate species are threatened. And some of these, such as the Hainan gibbon shown here, are extremely close to extinction. This may be the world's rarest mammal. There's only about 23, 25 known individuals. And this process, unfortunately, is escalating. Just this week, the Yangtze finless porpoise pictured here has been elevated to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, the highest level of threat recognized. And unfortunately, these extinctions are caused by human activity, a process which isn't restricted to the recent historical period and current day. And it's thought that human activities have been implicated in driving mammal species extinctions for the last thousands or tens of thousands of years. During the late Pleistocene, the last ice age glaciation, human activity is considered by many to be responsible for wiping out around 97 genera of large mammals. So in this kind of cartoon schematic, the black animals are where we still find very large mammals today in Africa and Southeast Asia. However, the white silhouettes indicate where, before human arrival around the world, we had analogous very large mammal ecosystems, so basically around the whole world. Climatic changes in the end of the Pleistocene are also possibly responsible for these large mammal extinctions. But in the subsequent Holocene epoch, the last 10 or so thousand years, climate has been very stable, but we've still lost up to 250 different mammal species, and this number is increasing as we discover more of them. Things like giant deer, aurochs, Madagascan hippos, and a whole range of other species. Most of these extinctions have taken place in islands in the past, shown by the distribution of red dots, the top map. And this is actually different to the distribution of mammal threat today. So it's interesting that human activities are thought to be responsible for both past and present recent extinctions, but the focus geographically is shifting. And similarly, although species extinctions in mammals in the recent past have also been taxonomically biased, i.e. certain taxonomic groups of mammals have been disproportionately affected by extinction, again, this pattern is different to what we see in the present day. And over a third of all mammal species thought to have been wiped out by humans in the last 10,000 years have actually been found in the Caribbean islands. So which is why you don't go to the Caribbean today for ecotourism, because everything there is already gone. So unfortunately, places like the Caribbean and other islands are not, with apologies to Maurice Sendak, where the wild things are, but where the wild things were. And so the unusual large mammal sleeping while a boat sneaks up behind it, unfortunately, is quite reminiscent of what happened in reality. However, as with the talks from the previous speakers, we are in no way certain that we know everything about mammal threat and mammal extinction. A large number of species today are still considered data deficient, even for a well-studied group such as mammals, i.e. we simply don't know enough about them to work out whether they're threatened or not. And similarly, for our understanding of past human impacts on ecosystems, we're still discovering more and more every year. The graph at the top shows what's called an accumulation curve. It shows the number of species being described over time. And this shows the number of extinct mammals known from the recent fossil record of the Caribbean. All of these species are considered to have been wiped out by humans following human arrival about 6,000 years ago. You can see this graph isn't tailing off, it's just continuing to grow over time. At the bottom are 3 different mammal species, 2 giant rodents and a primate, which I've been involved with describing from Caribbean fossil and archaeological deposits just in the last couple of years. So these, overall, there's data incompleteness, but also there are biases. At the top, you can see a couple of graphs, so I apologize for that. But they show an analysis that I've done looking at comparing the abundance of different species in the very recent fossil record with the abundance and distribution of species that you find in those environments today. And as you might expect, the more common a species is today, in very recent fossil deposits, that also has some influence on its likelihood of preservation. But other factors, notably body mass, are also very important in determining whether a mammal species is likely to be preserved. Basically, if a species is larger in body size, you're going to have it preserved better. So factors like these biases, really influence and distort our understanding of even recent extinctions from the recent past. And at the bottom is a related plot showing body mass and the description date of recently extinct species. And you can see over time, initially it was only large species that were being described, and over time more and more small-bodied species are being described. So we're still discovering and describing more species from the recent fossil record, but we basically missed all the small ones to begin with. So our understanding of trends and biases in extinction risk are very incomplete. Not only biologically and ecologically, but also geographically, there are also major biases in our understanding of human-caused extinction and human impacts on ecosystems. And in particular, certain areas of the world, notably Eastern Asia and China, where I also do a lot of work, probably have many more recently extinct species to yield from archaeological deposits and from the historical record. For example, species such as gibbons are very important in Chinese mythology. Their long arms are thought to channel qi energy and allowed them to live 800 years. Their song wistfully recalled home to travelers throughout the south and exiles. So they're a very important motif and trope in Chinese poetry. And there's on the plot on the right shows over 600 different historical records going back 1,000 years that I've dredged up from the Chinese literature, showing that gibbons used to be distributed across a very large area of China. Now they're only found in the very far south and southwest. And you can see that these records of gibbons show that gibbons persisted across much of China into the very recent historical period. The grey areas in the map of the maritime provinces of China show the presence of gibbons at the municipality level. And you can see from the 17th century, still large areas of much of eastern China contain gibbons. And over time, although these gibbon records disappeared, even into the 20th century, you still had gibbons in areas far from where you find them today. And it's very likely, given what we know about gibbon speciation, that these represented multiple new species of apes, which have now been driven to extinction by human activity. So if we still don't even understand primate, ape diversity and extinction, this just shows as the tip of the iceberg that we really have a lot more to learn about human-caused extinction and human threat for mammals, let alone for anything else. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks to all our speakers. What I'm going to do now is invite our panelists to come and sit at the front, and if we can have the lights back up so that we can sort of start a discussion. Okay. So since I'm the chair, I'm allowed to ask the first questions, which I will do. So we've heard a lot there about species discovery and species extinction, and I want to start off with a question which is a bit more of a light-hearted one in a sense, which is what advice could you give anyone who really wants to discover a new species?
Think small is what I would say, or think parasite. I mean, small, if you look at crustaceans, it's the same kind of graph that Sam showed, which is if you look over the last century and a half, the average size of new species that have been described within a group like Crustacea is getting lower and lower and lower. So it's not rocket science. The big things are found first and described. You're gradually working down the size spectrum. So think small and think obscure sites is one of the factors I would recommend.
Yeah. Charles?
I think another bit of advice might be learn your chemistry and become a molecular biologist, because a lot of species today are being discovered using the wonderful tools of modern molecular biology. And I guess if I was starting off today, I might become someone interested in bacteria, because what's so fascinating about bacteria is we're discovering their natural history on a day-to-day basis. Much as I love parasitic wasps, we've known what they've done for 400 years. Some of the really cute things that have been done by microscopic things are only being discovered today because of the new techniques available.
Yeah. Sam?
I think there's still relatively large areas of the world out there where one might be able to find even something like a new mammal or a new bird, the kind of thing that really gets you into the news. Certainly those areas of Southeast Asia that I showed on the map as being hotspots for threat, those areas are still having even medium-sized mammals turning up in them every now and again. In fact, in the news just, I think this week, a new bird species was found on the edge of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. So you don't even actually have to walk out of a major city in Southeast Asia to possibly find a new vertebrate. So whilst it's not massively likely if you're on a budget holiday out to Southeast Asia, there's still a chance.
Yeah, take your binoculars and your PCR machines with you for a bit of molecular biology on the side. Yeah. Well, I was also going to ask about regions of the world. I mean, we heard about Southeast Asia quite a bit then. We heard about the marine environment. Where else might we look?
Well, certainly within the marine, looking deep is a good idea, because the average depth of the oceans is 3.7 kilometers. And we know very little about the depths of the oceans. If you think, if you're fishing in the abyssal plain, 5,000 meters deep, you've got a net not much bigger than this screen in its mouth area on the end of a piece of wire that's 10 kilometers long, and you're hoping to catch marvelous things. So we've sampled. The limitations to sampling have limited the amount of information we have about the deep sea. Now we have these new ROVs, remote operated vehicles with video cameras. We are finding out a lot more about the bigger animals that can avoid nets. So these are important new tools in the armory of trying to look in the deep ocean. But yeah, deep, within the oceans, deep is a good place to look.
An easy answer is tropical rainforests. We know there's a lot of unknown species in tropical rainforests. Certainly my parasitic wasp, we know that you go to tropical rainforests, maybe 10%, 20% of what you find is new. A difficult question is that we don't know how much there is yet to be discovered, even for a group such as butterflies and moths. We think with butterflies we're sort of getting nearly there. With moths, we think it's really controversial. Some people have argued we may actually have about 3/4 of the species of at least large moths on Earth already described. Interestingly, many of them, although they've been described, there are only 1 or 2 specimens hidden away in museums. In the Natural History Museum where Jeff works, they're doing a big project at the moment to digitize all their collections. And it may be that actually a very good place to look for new species of insects is probably South Kensington, hidden in the drawers where...
Yeah. Do you want to try anything?
Yeah, I'd certainly say that pretty much every time I've gone to visit an international museum collection somewhere, I found something new hidden away in a drawer that's been there for 50 or 100 years, and chances are it might be a new species that no one's realised. In terms of understanding or trying to identify sites where you might find the remains of recently extinct species, systems where you have karst limestone are particularly good because you'll get very rich cave deposits which can either contain the remains of animals that have wandered into those caves and died on their own, or might contain archaeological remains, archaeological sites which can also be associated with faunas that have been hunted, consumed by humans. So certainly, say for the Caribbean region or China, I would focus on islands which are known to be limestone rather than anything else geologically, just because the conditions are right for, or more conducive to actually yielding and preserving the remains of recently extinct mammals.
Yeah. Could we look at one thing that none of us have mentioned really is how many species of animals have been described so far? Because as far as I understand, there is not yet one master list, if you like. And I wonder if you could comment on,
yes,
on
I
that
mean,
problem.
the numbers you see around now are about 1.9 million species. On average, in a year, about 17,000 new species of multicellular organisms are described. So 17,000, of which only 2,000 are marine. So there's an incredible bias. And of course, most of those 15,000 terrestrial ones are going to be insects, because that's the group that's hyper diverse in terms of species composition. But Charles already mentioned bacteria, which is a bit below the belt. But bacteria, when you play with numbers of bacteria, the numbers are just off scale.
But if we stick to animals, if you're saying that 1.9 million may have been described so far, there have been many attempts to estimate how many species of animals there are on the planet, often with a large amount of the use of back of envelopes and pencils. Where do you think those estimates are heading at the moment?
Well, I think there's been a sort of consensus recently around 8 to 9 million. But some people argue that's a tremendous underestimate. We're largely talking about animals, and Peter mentioned the fact that there is no master list. And that's true for animals, but Kew Gardens have been leading a project to get a master list for plants. And plants there are not a huge number of species. I think it's about 300,000. Mm-hmm. That's off the top of my head. So it's sort of more doable. And Kew managed a few years ago to get the first draft list of the flora of the world. And a lot of people are now trying to hone that down and to work out how many it is. But I think with plants, they reckon that there's probably 75% described already. So in some well-known groups, such as mammal, birds, and plants, we're getting pretty accurate answers. In the groups Jeff and I are interested in, it's a bit harder.
Well, in the marine world, I mean, we do actually have a list now, a world register, and it's about 250,000 species have been described. And the estimates are, using sort of macroecological methods, the estimates are that is between 1/3 and 1/6 of the real diversity. So the work we have done in describing new species, there's still quite a long way to go, but we do now have a list, which is important because it stops wasted effort, and it makes information much more accessible, because those lists, boring though they sound, are actually the index to life. They're the index to all those components that make up ecosystems that we're all part of.
Okay. I think I have more questions. I could sit here all evening and ask questions, but I'm now going to open up to the audience. This is an area, this is a discussion, and we'd like your input. So would anyone like to start off with another question for the panel? Yes, at the back. If we bring a microphone, that might be best.
I think we've got about 7 billion people on the planet now, haven't we? And apparently we produce 60 billion animals a year for food. Wouldn't it be better if governments made more of an effort to get people to either be vegan or only eat meat about once a week or less? I mean, the Chinese government was quite effective in having a one-child policy. Why don't they put the same amount of effort in stopping people going to a Western diet or, other really bad habits?
Okay, this is really a question about extinction, I think.
Well, I completely agree with you. However, I think if you go into the sort of politics of all those issues, I think unfortunately, not just in terms of diet, but in terms of general consumer goods and products that places like China and the developing world will see the West has and would want to emulate. So I think trying to reduce that pressure, the growing pressure in the developing world for those kind of things will mean you'd probably have to set the example in the West, which isn't going to happen. So I don't quite know how. There's definitely a crunch point coming along those lines, but I don't quite see how it's going to be averted, unfortunately.
If I might just briefly come, in my day job, I spend most of my time on food security now. And I agree with you completely. We have to, in the rich world, eat meat. And my view is not to go vegetarian, but to treat meat more as a special dish. And also within meat, there's a huge variation between some meat which has a relatively small environmental footprint and some that has a much greater. But I'm going to stop now because I can sort of bore for Britain on food security, and we should be talking about extinctions. And
there's another question in the middle of the row here, if we can get a microphone there. Thank you.
I'm sort of on the opposite spectrum what the ladies. I was reading in the National Geographic that there's also a threat to songbirds. Things like that, but one of the things that is happening, why is it that we don't pay the farmer or traditional people who, for instance, like the Inuit who hunt their food for their living? Why don't we pay them to look after their environment instead of paying them to produce more than is required?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to pass over to this. It's a food security question. Charles?
So just very briefly, there are a lot of people wondering how that can be done. In the jargon, we talk about ecosystem services, so what farmland produces in addition to food, but all the other wonderful things, including the songbirds and flood protection and storing carbon that would otherwise be in the environment. And it is one of the biggest research questions, both in natural sciences and in the social sciences, is that how we can incentivize farmers to do this. There are elements of the Common Agricultural Policy, the policy that sort of determines so much of what happens in the UK, that does that. In my view, not nearly as much, and what's happened in the last week about the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy worries me and doesn't give me any great confidence we're going in the right direction. But I think the question you've asked is extraordinarily important, and as I said, both in the developed world and in developing countries, a lot of work needs to be done on that.
Yes, Jeff.
So there was an interesting meeting here about 3 years ago, the Inter-Academy panel, and they had a meeting on biodiversity. And there was the sort of very high-level statement that we're going to have to do much better at managing the environment. We're going to have to manage the environment for resource use. We're going to have to manage the environment to maintain biodiversity at levels we can. However, there was also recognition that the science isn't particularly in place to enable us to do that. These systems are so complicated, we don't yet have the science in place to do that. And then about 2 weeks later, I was chairing an evening discussion at Birkbeck College on agri-environment schemes. And this was a guy who works for DEFRA, and part of his job was to enthuse farmers to leave these strips around the edge of fields where flowers that encourage pollinating insects can grow. And this is funded by grants from the EU and so on. And there was I was struck by the dichotomy. I mean, this guy is at the coalface of actually trying to change attitudes of farmers to encourage them with a little bit of carrot, because that always works better than a stick, a little bit of carrot to make their farms a little bit more environmentally friendly and biodiversity friendly. And there's a huge gulf of science that's missing between that and the statements that, you know, we're actually going to have to manage the environment because we are heading towards 9 billion people on this planet. So it's getting those two extremes and getting in the middle somehow to make it all work.
Okay, there's a question right at the back in the blue shirt, and then we'll take one down here near the front.
Hi. Sorry, I'm going to carry on this little theme. Intensive farming, and a friend of mine's just got a bee certificate, just applying for it, and she said she can't get any good honey because all the fields up in Kent are all intensive farms. They've got monocultures, and the best honey seems to be the ones in London, where all the people have their own rose bushes and stuff like that. There's more diversity in London, in the inner city. So I'm just wondering what your view may be on that.
So whether monoculture is having an effect on
Shall I take
insect
that?
health.
We know that there is a real problem with pollinators in this country and also in continental Europe and North America. And we don't know exactly why. And there are a variety of different explanations, and probably all components are acting together. One is our climate is already changing, and that affects pollinators. One of the biggest pollinators is the honeybee. The honeybee is suffering from a parasitic mite, which carries diseases and things. And then, into an unknown way, we have new insecticides. And we don't know the degree to which that they are affecting it. And so we know that this combination of things affecting our honeybees. Habitat loss and intensification is important, honeybees and pollinators in general. And again, this is one of the major policy areas that DEFRA is looking into at the moment. So a very good question. There's nasty things happening there which we don't yet fully understand.
There's a question on the second row here.
I was just wondering, when you're sampling, particularly with copiopods, it's just they're so small, and if you can find 10,000 in a litre of water, how do you stop? I mean, surely you could keep going forever. I mean, or do you just find a 3 and go, ooh, success, job done?
So this is a question about Jeff's career now.
Well, no, just in general,
So
I mean...
It's not per litre, it's per cubic metre. But anyway, but yes, I mean, it's possible in a week's field work to collect enough animals to work for a lifetime, in a sense. So it comes down to what all of us have to do, which is to prioritize things. So you prioritize animals that are causing economic damage, you prioritize animals that are essential parts of the food chain, that may or may not lead to human consumption and so on. So it is about priorities, and I think that applies to all of us. You know, the science there's so many fascinating questions, but ultimately most research is paid for by society. And so it's incumbent upon us to ask questions that we can justify as relevant. And I think we all tend to do that to a greater extent now than perhaps we did 50 years ago in science in general.
Okay, yes, the question, lady just behind. Thank you.
Hi there, I've got a question for Sam. In regards to the media and how the media home in on some animals that are more likely to become extinct than others. For example, you mentioned there about a mammal in China that's got 24 left in the world. So what is your view then on the media? And say, for example, if you look at all the money that was put into saving the panda and all the money at the moment was being generated into saving the tigers, and obviously, you know of a lot more species that are not getting the attention that these two species are. So what are your views on that, and what do you think that we could do to sort of raise the awareness in the public?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that I do sort of ponder quite a lot, actually. with my own experience with working with endangered species and conservation programs, I think when I started, I kind of naively assumed that if you had a species which was on the verge of extinction, and you had a press release and tried to get it out there into the press, people would pick that up and run with it, and it would become a news story. Because this is when we started work on the Yangtze River dolphin. When I started working on that, it was assumed there were a few left, but it was definitely thought to be one of the world's rarest mammals and very much in danger of extinction. And it was surprising how kind of little interest there appeared to be to promote that, because in a sense it was quote unquote just another endangered species. And I think because there's been this sort of save the world, save the rainforest mentality, which is very good in the media for sort of 20, 30 years now, I think my personal opinion is I think there has been some sort of like burnout from that people have been saying, well, the media's been saying the world's about to end, the environment's about to collapse for decades now, and nothing's actually happening. So, and what was particularly tragic is then when we discovered the Yangtze River dolphin was actually extinct, it was only then that it became a news story. And I definitely think that had there been more interest, whether or not it would have been too late already, I think there could potentially have been some further leverage that could have been applied had there been more international attention on it, when there could have still been a chance. What is interesting as a result of that, though, I was quite pessimistic after the dolphin disappeared, that there's a second cetacean, which I mentioned, the Yangtze-Finnis porpoise, which is now critically endangered. And I was quite pessimistic, and I assumed that, well, it's going to be the same story again. That's just going to slide away towards extinction. No one's really going to care until it's too late for that as well. And both within China and internationally, it's been, I guess the silver lining is that it's been a vaguely pleasant surprise that there has been quite a lot of media attention on that. And it's in the news this week in New Scientist, for example. So possibly the disappearance of the Yangtze River dolphin might have changed the situation slightly in terms of media interest and awareness that actually some species do go extinct on our watch. It's not just something that happened in the distant past with dodos, or species are about to go extinct, but they never kind of quite do. It's always going to be in the future. So I think that might have changed attitudes somewhat. But then with species like the Hainan gibbon, the species that you mentioned, yes, that is probably the world's rarest mammal now, and it would be really great to try and promote that a lot more. But again, I think conservation can still be seen as quite a dirty word sometimes in the media, that it requires people to care maybe more than television companies might want you to. So I mean, there's certainly some sort of personal opinions, but I do think there's an element of truth in some of that.
This is a complex issue, of course, and there's a tension always between putting resource and money into saving individual species versus a sort of ecosystem level approach. I wondered if you could comment on that. Yeah, there's definitely been sort of different fashions in conservation over the years as well, that initially, I think when there was more of a zoo-based focus for conservation several decades ago, everything was very much species-focused, and if you can save a species conceptually, even if it's in a zoo rather than in the wild, then that's a great thing. And there's elements of panda conservation in that pandas are, whenever there's a new panda comes to a zoo, it's a big media fanfare, and there's basically a lot of exchange between China and other countries for pandas, and that's sort of how a lot of panda conservation is played out. But then over the last couple of decades, there's been this greatly increased awareness within conservation research and conservation practice that in many cases, just having a species continuing as its lineage within captivity is, if not pointless, but misses a lot of the point, that we should be trying to save whole ecosystems, having species functioning in their evolutionary context within the wider environment, the landscape in which they evolved. And that is certainly an extremely important thing to do. But then you have to juggle both. You can't focus either on a species-focused conservation ethos or a landscape-focused conservation ethos. Because with the situation with the Yangtze, the idea was, well, we've got to save the whole river basin. Focusing on the dolphin isn't going to be enough, but then the dolphin has now gone extinct. So focusing at the ecosystem level alone clearly didn't work. So it's dangerous, I think, to be too polarized in either camp, but to make sure that you try and integrate elements of both in conservation. Okay. Shall we take another? There's lots of hands going up. So I'm going to start with the lady on the aisle here, and then we'll go near the back of the room.
The word copepod is one I've never heard of before, and it seemed to be very important with regard to, again, crustaceans. But when you put all the pictures up, they all look so different. I don't see how they can all be put together and called copepods. So perhaps you could give us a bit more information.
Okay, well, copepod means oar-footed, so it's from the Greek, as in oars for rowing, so it means oar-footed. And actually, with some of those very highly transformed parasites, if you look at the larval stages, which have to swim around to find a host, they have the typical copepod oar-footed swimming legs. So as juveniles, when they first hatch, they look much more typical. And of course, we have these tools now, molecular tools, which you can use to identify animals by looking at barcodes, for example. And that helps you to confirm that they are, in fact, copepods. But I always used to say, if you look at any marine animal and you see a pair of egg sacs sticking out randomly from it, then it's probably got a copepod inside it.
Okay, there's a question. First of all, the gentleman in the blue shirt and then in the grey shirt.
So is the copepod, is it the only method of, you only find them in water? Can they float up in the clouds and be travelled that way and then go around the world? And then
Well, I have seen evolutionary trees that actually have insects as the next branch to copepods, in which case I could claim insects as flying crustaceans and crying. No, they don't. I mean, basically, they need water. You can find them in damp terrestrial situations. I know someone who has them in their lawn in New Zealand, which is a damp lawn, so they will be in damp sediments. But no, they are aquatic crustaceans.
Yeah, in the grey shirt, yes.
Thank you. With the discovery of chemosynthesis and like ecosystems completely independent of the sun, that kind of flipped everything on its head. But as far as the kind of shadow biosphere idea, is there any kind of credit to that?
I'm not sure I really understand the shadow biosphere, but there are certainly interesting systems that we find now that are chemosynthetically based. So as well as the hydrothermal vents, if you drill down in rock, on land, 2 kilometers, you find bacterial communities, so microbiological communities that they call slimes, sublithospheric microbial ecosystems, and so these are functioning communities. All members of those communities are microbes of one sort or another. But what it's done is it's expanded our perception of the biosphere, the part of the planet that's habitable by organisms, actually is much larger than we realized. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but basically there's life almost everywhere where we've looked within reason on Earth at the moment.
A most astounding thing was that until about, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong in this, until about 40 years ago, we thought there were two types of organism on Earth. The cellular organisms, the posh word is eukaryotes, and then all the rest, the bacteria. And then I think in the 70s it was discovered that actually the bacteria were two groups as distinct from each other as either are from us, the higher organisms. And this was the sort of beginning of the tsunami of new things that had been discovered about the microbial world. And I think most of the curious things that Jeff was talking about deep underground belong to the newly discovered group of, they're called archaea, so they're related to the eubacteria, the sort of posh bacteria, but very different, and as different from what were traditionally known as bacteria as from us.
Yes, question here.
Cheers. To Professor Boxall, have you found any, of course there's different symmetries in the natural world, have you found any new biologies? And to Professor Holland, do you find that the conservation effort is anti-indigenous and anti-poor?
Yes, could you repeat that?
Right. Do you find that the conservation issue is anti-indigenous and anti-poor?
Right. Well, we'll start with the new biology question. I think that's the
Well,
broadest
I
question.
think I have a friend called Richard Forte who talks about any species having its biography. And I like the analogy because it's understanding the way of life of any species is fascinating. And giving something a name is absolutely the very first, most basic step. But then we have to fill in the information about the biology. Now, these, just almost every group will do a huge variety of things. So copepods will feed on algae, they'll feed on bacteria, they'll feed on fish. They're parasitic on everything from sponges to whales. So they utilize the whole spectrum of other organisms that are available. They burrow in between the upper and lower surface of seaweed fronds. So basically, they're like most groups. If there is a resource, their biology is inventive enough, given evolutionary time, for them to be able to exploit that resource.
Yeah, I'll give another example along the lines of new biology, which is what my main research interest is in what we call body plans. That's how is the body put together? How do you actually build an animal? You know, where's the nervous system going to be? Where are the muscles, etc. And I think for a long time we thought we had a pretty good understanding of what was possible and what was not possible in the diversity of different ways of building the body. And we had a bit of a surprise a few years ago when we started looking at a very unusual and very obscure worm called Budembrochia plumatelli. Now this is a tiny little parasitic worm, it's just a few millimeters in length. It was first discovered in 1850, not properly described, and been hardly ever seen since. But we were able to get hold of some of these and started to look at them in a little bit more detail. And what we were really surprised to find is that although they're worms and they swim around like worms, they have no front end, they have no back end, they have no nervous system, they have no mouth, no anus, no gut. They're completely different to anything else. And it turned out from the molecular biology, they're closely related to things like jellyfish and sea anemones. So it's a completely independent evolution of the worm shape. So to me, as someone interested in how the body is put together, that's new biology that we find by looking at some of these really unusual animals in detail. Any other comments on?
Can I just take the issue about pro-poor and indigenous people? And I think if you look at the history of conservation, you can find some bad examples. And I think everyone in the conservation world today interested in conservation in developing countries absolutely understands that it must be pro-poor, it must help bring people out of rural poverty. I was in northern Kenya just over a year ago and saw some wonderful projects among the Samburu people in the north, where people were getting, these are normally pastoralists, who were in addition getting some money for looking after the wildlife and getting money from a bit of ecotourism. And that was a wonderful example of how modern conservation really works for the benefits of the poorest people on the planet.
Yeah. Yes, second row.
If you allow me, I'd like to make two questions. And the first one is, how do you work with bringing into new species into Britain, for example? Because in the Amazon, I know that it's largely debatable in Brazil, and there are many scandals of biopiracy. So I want to know, how do you legally bring the new species, because especially in the Amazon it's a huge, huge problem. And my second question is, why is biodiversity important? Because, well, yeah, the line, how you can divine the line, what is, which species is important and which ones that, you know, we have, which is a matter of biophilia or biophobia. So how can you divine the line?
We'll start with the easy question, which is biopiracy, which is a minefield, and then we'll move to the difficult question of the importance of biodiversity. Thank you.
Well, the landscape has changed about collecting and, you know, ownership or stewardship of organisms. And the UK and most governments are signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now that recognizes the idea of equitable sharing of benefits arising from biodiversity. That's absolutely enshrined in the fundamental principle. So the answer is a lot more is collaborative, there are a lot more partnerships, and it's done much more in the way that all of us would recognize as a fair and equitable way of doing it. So, for example, if I describe new species, I've been describing some from Indonesia. Indonesia has very restrictive laws on collecting and export of biological material. I had to have permits to do that. I worked with Indonesians, and the type specimens, the reference specimen, which will forever be the one that you go back to refer to if there's any confusion about the name of an animal, that specimen is back in the museum just outside Bogor on Sumatra. And that's exactly how it should be. So they have the types, we shared the work together, and it goes back to an institution in country, because the good thing is they have massive biodiversity. It helps to build up their reference collections. It helps, by working in partnership, it helps to build up their expertise, and actually more gets done. And it's exactly the same with Brazil. Brazil has very strong protective laws now, but I've been to Brazil many times. I've worked with Brazilians, described material, and the material goes back to São Paulo, to the University Museum, which functions as a major national center for them, and that is how it should be. And I think most responsible biologists sign up to that these days.
Okay. I think if we move to the importance of biodiversity, I'm going to ask Charles to take that.
It's an enormous question. I'll just give a very brief answer. So there's a huge amount of work going on today to actually ask the precise question you have done. And when you actually look at what biodiversity does, it provides all sorts of services to society, which often we're overlooked. We just take them for granted. So diverse forests provide flood protection, they lock up carbon. If you look at some of the wonderful ecosystems, and they provide genes that are used in plant breeding. We know that more diverse, and there's a good series of experiments that have shown us that more diverse communities are more resilient, so they're better able to withstand climate change and things like this. So again, it's a very big area to try and understand it. But I would counsel against having a purely utilitarian view on biodiversity. I think biodiversity its importance, its value to society is underestimated. But I think that there is also, we are stewards, our generation is stewards. I don't think we have the right to destroy all of biodiversity so that our children and grandchildren and their descendants won't have access to it. But it's only one of the many things we have to do, and we've heard the interesting question about pro-poor and development. So we have to work together on a very broad series of fronts on climate change, on resource scarcity, on food security and biodiversity. And we have to approach these questions as a unitary goal of humanity over the next 200 years, of which the value of biodiversity for society is part, but our ethical, moral duty to maintain at least a large chunk of it is also a component.
There were some questions towards the back of, yes, in the middle of the block there. Is there a mic? Yeah, there's a microphone on its way.
Thank you very much for 3 very interesting and accessible talks for lay people. What I was wondering was, given that there's no master list, how is there a consensus reached when something is new? And on the flip side, we've got a list of what might be extinct, or what might become extinct. What are the factors that are considered when we're putting them on the list? I know it's an absolute numbers thing, but also the biology of it, and is it what country it's found, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting questions. So we'll...
Perhaps I'll deal with the consensus on how something is described as new. I mean, Charles actually encapsulated the process in his 7-minute talk, which is that he sent his information to the expert on that group who happened to live in northern Germany and asked for his opinion. And that, in microcosm, is the peer review process. So if you wish to describe something as new, you're going to publish it, you submit it to a journal, they send it out to experts in the field, wherever they are, and it is very international now. So they will go all around the world, and that information, it will come back and say, sorry, this isn't new, or it will say, yeah, no, this is really interesting, but you're using a terminology that's a bit out of date, and so on. So that feedback process of peer review is incredibly important, but it does work on that basis. It still works on that basis.
And I think it's worth adding to that, mistakes are made.
Yes.
And then they can be revisited as someone else looks more closely and says, no, actually, this new species you described had already been described, and to merge the two together. So these things are looked at over time in a lot of detail. Does anyone want to add anything further on new species before we... Because I think the other thing we really want to discuss in response to your question is, we've heard these words vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered. I think we need a bit of explanation and discussion as to what those terms really mean.
Formal definitions that assessing how threatened a species is or whether it's threatened or not. It's developing internationally recognised protocols and categories and criteria for this is something that's been developed over several decades, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is based partly in Cambridge and partly in Switzerland, is the kind of international arbiter for this now, that it's recognised at a global standard, that it will try and evaluate the status of as many species as possible, and it's an ongoing process. Now that this has been done for all the world's mammals, birds, many of these other relatively well-known charismatic groups, but there's still a lot of work ongoing for many of the invertebrates and things like that, for which there are fewer people working on them and also far less data. But in terms of actually how to define these categories, so one would say a species is threatened if it's regarded as either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And each of those terms has got a formal definition. So a species, and they all depend on various different factors of biology and threat. So, for example, the level of decline, the amount by which a population has declined over unit time, the amount at which it has declined, the amount at which it's predicted to decline, whether those threats that are causing those declines are or aren't reversible, or aren't even known, for example. So a species might have declined quite heavily, but then if you just enforce hunting, that decline could stop. Alternatively, if it lives somewhere like the Yangtze, where ship traffic and pollution is ongoing and probably not reversible, even if those two populations might have declined by the same amount, you might evaluate them quite differently in terms of the actual threat status. And so these quantitative cut-offs, so I think for vulnerable, if there's been 30% decline over 10 years or 3 generations, that goes up to 50%, up to 70% for endangered, critically endangered. So, and there's other factors as well, so the geographic area over which a species is known or inferred to occur, levels of fluctuation in population, numbers of mature individuals. So these quite sort of scientific, robust indices by which we can try and evaluate different species according to a standard metric and assess. So if you say this mammal species is endangered and this fish species is vulnerable and this cycad is critically endangered, they all ideally would mean comparable things. So this is very much an ongoing process, and the categories may well be modified further in the future, but it's a lot better than it was maybe in the 60s, 70s, where the definitions are more vague.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious I'm not sure if there are any questions around here where I can't see very well. So I'm going to take these 2 questions here.
Hi, yeah. We've already heard about sort of conservation charities in the media that promote sort of mammals and the nice furry animals. But I don't know, from a layman's perspective, it seems the threat to our ecosystem comes more from the lower levels of microscopic organisms, or if we lose bees, changes in bacteria. So does the panel think that those areas get enough sort of promotion in the public eye? And is there any ideas on how they could sex it up, I suppose?
Well, I had the privilege of being until recently a vice president of BugLife. And BugLife is trying to do for the unrequited organisms that Jeff and I study, what the RSPB have done for birds and various other things. So yes, there are a variety of conservation organisations. I mean, the one thing I would say, which I think all of us here are really enthusiastic about, is it goes by the jargon name of citizen science. Most of the science you hear about in the Royal Society can only be done in labs with very expensive equipment. But so much of biodiversity science doesn't require, some does, but much doesn't require a huge amount of equipment. And we as professional biologists relying a huge amount on this army of citizen science who work on biodiversity. So even if you have, some of you may be very active in this area, but even if you have half an interest, join local societies. There's marvelous information on the web. You can really make a difference to what we know about biodiversity.
And another question, yeah.
It's on. Thank you very much. I echo the appreciation of very accessible presentations. I was wondering how relevant or not is public understanding and acceptance of our evolution of our own species to public understanding and acceptance of issues relating to biodiversity, to conservation and extinction, the kind of issues you've been discussing today.
Who wants to pick that one up?
Well, I would think that it's certainly been suggested quite a lot that with an appreciation at a cultural level of our evolutionary heritage comes the concomitant association that it can lead to a sort of cultural connectivity towards the environment more than if we're considered to be some sort of unique creation which therefore is entitled to use natural resources because that's what God told us to do. They're just there for our consumption. I think that could be a sort of spin-off of appreciating evolution, is the appreciation that we are connected to the environment on a more fundamental level.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, question here. And then there was a question, a hand went up over there.
How much is current taxonomy, and I guess future taxonomy, going to be completely sequence-based? Or is there a space for describing something that might have the similar sequence, I mean, relevant to the current technologies as something else, but looking at it, you think it's different?
I think these are different kinds of evidence. And, you know, as scientists, you use and interpret all evidence that's available. I mean, when I joined the museum, which was a seriously long time ago, a colleague there was having to give evidence in a murder trial because a body had been washed up in the Thames estuary and it had amphipod lice in the clothing on the body. And the police wanted to know if they had come in, if they were marine ones that had come in when the body was downstream, or whether they were freshwater and they'd come with the body, you know. So this was part of the forensic work. And so he went to court and he was cross-examined by the defense lawyer and so on. And they were gentler days. Now, I picture myself going to court now without molecular evidence, and a lawyer would just tear you to shreds and say, what do you mean? It's your opinion that it's species A, B, or whatever it was. So if I were in a similar position now, I would want every piece of evidence at my disposal that I could. So I think there's an absolute synergy, and a lot of the high-level information that we have about the classification of organisms, that's come because we've developed these new genetic tools, and they're incredibly powerful. They're not going to go away. Taxonomists are going to use them.
But I think you make a really good point there, and I think that the avalanche of molecular data we're seeing at the moment will become ever greater. And I think one of the greatest challenges for taxonomists and people who care about taxonomy is how the subject is going to evolve in order that it can utilize and not be swamped by this vast amount of data. And I think that taxonomy, which is one of the oldest areas of science, dates back to Linnaeus in the 18th century, in some ways it can be a victim of its own success because it invented a wonderful way of doing things, but it was a way that sort of worked before the modern techniques. And I think the real challenge that people like Jeff are really leading on is how the subject evolves to make use of the wonderful information facilities in the internet and things like this. And it won't be long before, I mean, remember Star Trek with the tricorder. We will have machines like that within a couple of decades where we can point at plants and get a readout of the identification. It will be a different world in 20 or 30 years' time.
Can I try and tie together two questions that we've had there in terms of how do you know you've got a new species and what do you do, and the molecular evolution? Because surely if we take this to its logical extreme, then simply sequencing a piece of DNA from your unknown organism could be cross-referenced very quickly to a much larger database, a much more organized database than we have today, and short-circuit some of these issues. Do you see this? Do you see this happening?
One thing that we have all been talking about is basically modern-day species. And I've touched on recent extinctions going back of the order of hundreds or thousands of years. But we should bear in mind that for the fossil record, for the deep time fossil record, that kind of genetic sequence data is not available. So those species will always be diagnosed on morphological grounds. And certainly even for a lot of the relatively recently extinct species, for example, from tropical regions in particular, like the Caribbean, even though some of these species may have only died out thousands or even hundreds of years ago, because the environmental conditions are particularly unfavorable for biomolecule DNA preservation, because the humidity, the heat, it can be effectively impossible to get any kind of genetic sequence data out from a lot of these Caribbean mammals, for example. Which means that, first of all, it's got various implications. First of all, it means that morphology will always remain important, possibly primarily, possibly not as new techniques develop in the future, in terms of species diagnosis. But also, it leaves this potential mismatch, or at least the fact that different sources of data are likely to be being used to diagnose different sorts of species, which then brings us on to this whole different sort of philosophical scientific issue of, if you're defining one species on the basis of morphology of bones and another species on the basis of DNA, presumably we're talking about the same kinds of things, but there is potential that actually what we might infer as a species of extinct shrew from the Caribbean versus a species of shrew from the mountains of Guatemala, the concept of species there might somehow be something different.
But surely, I mean, really what we're talking about there in the modern taxa, living taxa, would be a combination of sort of evidence of both the morphology and the molecular biology. But the molecular biology may provide a shortcut.
I think that's right. And I think that it will happen. And I think the real challenge for what might be called traditional taxonomy is to have the systems and the networks set up such that it can embrace these new technologies. Because if we don't, it'd be a tragedy, because 300 years of information about the biology of an organism will get disconnected from the way people are identifying it using their tricorders and other machines such as that. So I think that's the enormous challenge. And I know the museum and Kew have been thinking very carefully about these issues.
Well, yes. I mean, the pace is relentless, but the power of the tools is just staggering now. And the amount of genetic data that's becoming available, the data doubling time, so that the sum of human knowledge about DNA sequence data doubles every 3 months. That's absolutely staggering pace of information growth. And you know, the bottlenecks have moved on. It's how we manage and how we analyze those data. But it's an immense resource for taxonomists, and we just have to get more efficient at using it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, there's a question here, and then the one just in front.
Thank you. What do you think about the sort of the advent of GM cloning in terms of conservation? I think recently there was an ibex in the north of Spain that they tried to clone and bring back because it was extinct. And how do you think, is that technology getting towards a stage where it could be used more frequently to bring back more recently extinct species?
Okay, resurrection of species.
Certainly, it's a subject which gets in the media a lot, and a lot of ancient DNA researchers will poo-poo the idea and say, well, it's almost pointless to debate whether you could whether you should or shouldn't bring a mammoth back because you just can't. But I think possibly for some species, like the recent gastric brooding frog success in Australia, was it last week or a couple of weeks ago, where they managed to get an egg to start dividing at least, by the team that are trying to bring back the thylacine. It certainly leads to a lot of good discussion. I think there has been this worry amongst conservationists and conservation researchers that if people think you can just bring a species back once it's gone extinct, then that means you don't really have to bother trying so hard in the first place to conserve them in their natural ecosystem. I think that's an issue, but to be honest, I don't think that's really going to be a problem. I think that people will, I would hope at least, that governments and researchers will always prioritise stopping that species going extinct in the first place, because it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to bring 99.99% of species back. So probably the amount of effort invested in that is probably maybe even more than protecting a national park.
Yeah, if nothing else, it's going to be cheaper to save a species than bring one back, I think. Yeah. There was a question just in front there.
I just wanted to ask what were your views on the fine line between animal extinction and then animal cruelty? Because there is a lot of emphasis in the media about extinction, but there are organisations and charity which are not really emphasised a lot. Like I do remember the Culling Cove in Japan, where there was a lot of animal cruelty on dolphins, and then in China there's a farm with the cats and dogs. Just what are your views on the different emphasis put on both? Because eventually the animal cruelty will lead to animal extinction.
Okay.
That's a good question. And I think that actually is very much one of the issues that in conservation that you have to be aware of. And it basically comes down to the difference between people caring about individuals and people caring about species. And it's far easier for people to empathise with individuals, be they individual animals, individual football teams, individual characters in soap operas, rather than issues at a species level or at a human global population level. And certainly one can lead to the other, but I have to say, in my experience, I think it's actually harder to make people become aware and care about the slightly more abstract concept of an entire species going extinct when there's no almost figurehead individual from that species to connect to. And certainly this is one of the arguments why zoos can, for example, retain their relevance, because the individual animals in those zoos, which can have animal adoptions and can have press releases about those individuals, can act as kind of flagships or ambassadors for the species. So in fact, I think one of the few semi-good things that did come out of Yangtze dolphin conservation efforts was that there was a single Yangtze dolphin in captivity for 22.5 years. And if 99.9% of all photos of Yangtze dolphins are of that animal in that dolphinarium, and obviously that animal itself was taken out of the gene pool and didn't contribute to, well, the inevitable extinction of the species, didn't contribute to its conservation. But I think the fact that that animal was there did help raise its conservation profile far more than the species got. So it is a trade-off, and certainly in any kind of conservation project, you want to make sure that any kind of activities you do for individual animals are in that individual's welfare and best interests. But often it can come down to this trade-off between, if you want to save a species, how do you actually work with individual animals as well?
Okay, yes, on the front row. Could we just wait for a microphone to come? Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask what I think of as a $64,000 question. Would it matter if the pandas had become extinct? Okay, I know there's a big R factor for pandas, but in a sense, evolution is about the evolution of new species and the dying out of species that are less able to survive. And whilst I can obviously understand if a species is being threatened by humans and we can put a stop to that, that's one thing. But, you know, are you in danger of playing God? How do you determine which species should survive and which can be let go?
Well, I think we should, let's take that as the broad question. I don't think we should focus on the panda specifically. We'll be here all evening and time is running short. But I think it's a really important question. Where do we focus the efforts for conservation?
Yeah, it is one of the big questions. And certainly when I started as a conservation researcher, I kind of assumed that even within conservation, everyone was broadly on the same page. But that's actually not the case. You can have very different ideas and attitudes between conservationists in terms of, should you try and pour all your resources into bringing back a species which is down to a handful of individuals, or at the other end of the spectrum, should you invest your resources in trying to maintain continuous healthy ecosystems like the forests of Siberia, the forests of New Guinea, which are still broadly continuous over large areas, so they're still retaining their ecosystem function. But another component as well to that argument is the issue of playing God, what do we save, is a very important one. In part, that's because of the fact that we've got such limited resources. Ideally, I would advocate saving everything. The problem is we don't have the money, resources, manpower capacity to do so. But that said, we also have to bear in mind that you could say that we're playing God now and trying to select species A over species B to save, but basically all species that are threatened today are threatened because of human activities. So that's where the playing God has come in. For pandas, they used to be common across all of China and Burma, and their massive scale range decline fragmentation is entirely anthropogenically caused. Bamboo forests used to be across that whole region, so yes, they are regarded in this cutesy way in the media as a kind of a failure as an animal. But in fact, they're so common in the fossil record. They are the index fossil for China of the late Quaternary. So they were incredibly successful. But if you have 1.3 billion people and strip away all their resources, not only pandas, but nothing can really survive that. So all these different factors that need to be brought to the discussion.
There are some scientific ways of making those choices about priorities. I don't know if you want to say just very briefly something about the EDGE program.
The EDGE program. Yes.
Yeah, no, because I think that is a set of criteria that enable you to identify some higher priorities.
Yeah, so different conservation organisations have typically been reasonably subjective about how they select species to prioritise, and often it's the large charismatic cutesy species. So there's lots of organisations that focus on tigers, elephants, pandas, because of this kind of human connection to them, if nothing more. But at the Zoological Society of London, we've got what we hope is a more objective way of identifying priorities based on evolutionary history. So combining the standardised threat assessment for species with a measure of how unique, quote unquote, they are in terms of how many close relatives they do or don't have. So basically, if you lose a species with no close relatives, you lose a whole branch of the tree of life because there's nothing like it left. Something like a duck-billed platypus or an aardvark, there's nothing like that if that species goes. Whereas if you lose a brown rat, but you've still got black rats and 200 other rat species left, obviously the loss of that single species is a tragedy, but you've got other species which are extremely similar, filling very similar ecosystem roles, either in the same environment or another environment. So it's one attempt to provide an objective framework for assessing which species maybe the world should invest its resources in.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the discussion there because I'm conscious of the time now. But I want to stop by just sort of, first of all, thanking the panellists, but also thanking you, because I think it's been a really interactive and productive discussion. So thanks, everybody.